they do, right? We think Adolf Hitler was a bad guy because we won World War II and he didn't. If the Nazis had won World War II, rest assured we would probably think differently, right? On the other hand, it's not always true, as it turns out. And the best example of the losers, right, in the history books is the American Civil War. After the Civil War, the Southerners embark on this sort of massive intellectual project of sort of refashioning the Civil War as a good thing that they did for good reasons, right? It wasn't we were slave owners who fought to defend slavery because slavery was great. It was instead we were brave guys defending our part of the country and our way of life from people who were attacking us. And it was a noble thing that we were involved in, right? Guys like Jefferson Davis, Jubal Early, they all go out on sort of speaking tours and they sort of stress this theme, right? Some Southerners don't have any part of it. Robert E. Lee never talks about the Civil War again, period. He doesn't want to have anything to say about it. He's done, that's it. Practically every other Southerner writes a memoir aggressively sort of pursuing this. Everybody's got a score to settle about the war in the South anyway, right? George Pickett attacks Lee for Gettysburg. Longstreet attacks everyone for blaming him for the loss of Gettysburg. Everybody's got an axe to grind. But most of the Southern memoirs are sort of obsessed with sort of setting the record straight about what the war was really about, right? And so this narrative is often referred to as the lost cause, the idea that we were all valiant men fighting for our homes and our freedom and our families and our way of life, and we were overwhelmed by the Northerners who had more men and more numbers, as though having more men in the army is like, means you're bad at war, right? Like you should have beaten us with fewer men, but you stink at war, so you beat us with more. And so I mean, doesn't make any sense, but that's fine. And so they had this sort of mythology about it. And of course, the iconic statement of it is Gone with the Wind, right? So Scarlett O'Hara is just a victim. You know, she was treated terribly by the Union. And as you wonder, why is Scarlett in such a terrible situation? Why are Union soldiers burning Georgia? Oh, it's because Georgia seceded from the Union, right? But that's not really part of the story, right? That's not part of the story. The KKK is a huge part of this. In the 1880s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a guy named Thomas Dixon writes a number of novels about the KKK. One of them is called The Klansman. And in it, it's sort of this pro-Southern, pro-Democrat, anti-Reconstruction side of the story. He talks about how the government carried out elections under bayonets, under military rule. Well, we had to, right? But no, this was unfair to the Southerners, right? And so in the 20th century, a guy named D.W. Griffith is making a movie about American history called The Birth of a Nation, and he adapts Dixon's novel to be the Reconstruction portions of the story. And it's a triumph of filmmaking because it shows these massive crowd scenes, these big gatherings of freedmen get broken up by the KKK, and it's no special effects. It's all people, actual people on horses, and a guy shouting, action, and they ride in, and you have hundreds and hundreds of extras, and they get all the freedmen to stand in the right positions, and somebody shouts action, and everybody starts singing or whatever, and then the freedmen, the KKK come in, and it's amazing. It's the first movie ever shown at the White House. Woodrow Wilson called it electric. He said, like lightning on the screen to see the moving pictures. And you can see here, actually, the D.W. Griffith quoted, he quoted Woodrow Wilson in the movie. It was a silent movie, so it had this nice little text card that popped up. The white men were roused to a mere instinct of self-preservation. Until at last there sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire in the South to protect the Southern country. And so the KKK are refashioned not as racist terrorists intent on opposing the federal government trying to institute civil rights, but as valiant defenders of the Southern way of life, right? Good guys who fought hard and got defeated or saved the day or whatever, right? And so this narrative is incredibly pernicious and persists to the present day. The significant number of Americans will tell you that the Civil War was not about slavery, which is simply false. That's simply false. But of course, from the lost cause point of view, that makes perfect sense. Of course the Civil War is about slavery. Nobody can be proud of going to war to defend slavery. What if we were defending our way of life, or our rights? States' rights is the phrase, right? But of course, the next question is, which states' rights? The right to own slaves, right? And so the KKK in this narrative becomes the good guys, right? And so in the 20th century, when the KKK gets reborn, ironically, you can see here, here is a KKK rally. I believe this is in the state of Florida. And they're engaged in their traditional activity of a cross burning, right? The irony is that the original KKK didn't burn crosses. They would have just shot people instead. Burning a cross is, why would you burn a cross when you could burn somebody's barn or you could shoot them, right? But when Griffith, in his movie, based on the Dixon novel, wanted to show a KKK meeting, he just had a bunch of guys in the woods, and he didn't really, so what do you do? So he gave them the white costumes, based off of the masks that the original KKK wore, because they showed up really good in the black and white, as you can see, right? And you got to do something. You can't have a bunch of guys in costumes hanging out in the woods talking. So instead, someone came up with the idea of what if they erect a giant cross and burn it? would show up really good on camera, right? It's a really good focal point for the viewer to watch. So they wrapped it across a oil-soaked rags, and the KKK guys erected it and set it on fire. So in the 19-teens and 20s, when the KKK got a second wind and revived for the second time, if you're a guy who's in the KKK, you've all seen the movie, so you say, guys, let's start a new chapter of the KKK. Okay, you get the white robes, you get a big cross, and you get the bottle of kerosene, and we'll have a crossbow. And remember, these guys are imitating a movie, not real life, right? They're essentially imitating the movie actors that played KKK members because they assume that that's what the real KKK was actually like, right? And so the irony here is that the original KKK didn't do any of that stuff, but because of the popular culture of the KKK, they did, right? And so that's why the KKK does what it does. And we'll talk about them a little bit in the 20s and 30s, and a lot more in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement when they come around a second time, right? And so life imitating art imitating life, yeah.
Oh, D.W. Griffith's next movie after Birth of a Nation, I think, was called Intolerance.
Really?
And it was all about, like, examples of intolerance and racism, which is really interesting. I think he felt bad about how his previous movie had caused this whole wave of, well,
Yeah, but these guys in the
so
KKK is back again, right?
He had like this real change of heart.
The sad thing is that if you went to school, even that's the thing about the textbooks. The winners write the history books. No, they don't. For basically decades, if you went to a school and you learned about Reconstruction, you learned the Woodrow Wilson thing, right? I mean, that was just what it was taught, right? And so for Griffith to come around and make a movie called Intolerance would have been a big deal because he would have had to learn about Reconstruction not from anybody mainstream, right? I mean, the actual narrative of it was basically unknown. And so even in northern states, they just sort of were like, well, it was bad, it was tragic. The Republicans forced the Southerners to do a bunch of things they didn't want to do, and the KKK was defending the South, and blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't really until the 60s that people started writing books about how, like, that's a stinking pile of bullshit, right? And so, I mean, it was entirely possible if you went to high school in the 50s, and then your kid went to high school, like, in the 80s or 90s, they would learn something almost totally different about this, right? And so I think Griffith probably did feel bad, because I think a lot of people who saw Birth of a Nation, that was the view of the Reconstruction in the South that they had, right? The Southerners are basically good guys who got put upon and fought back. And it's like, well, no, yes, but also there was the racism, element of it. And so Wilson, by the way, did not like the fact that he got quoted in the movie. He was grumpy about the fact that this got associated with him, which is, I mean, on the one hand, I feel bad about Wilson. He's a goddamn racist, so I guess probably he could just, not have feelings. And so we'll talk more about Wilson, but that's fascinating to know about Griffith. And then a guy made a movie a couple of years ago called The Birth of a Nation about the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1830, and he used the title specifically, right? He used it to do that, right? And so for years, again, in the South, this was the narrative that people learned. My mother went to high school in Texas, and she said they were taught it was called the War of Northern Aggression. Like, the good old Southerners are just hanging out, doing their thing, and the evil Northerners are like, let's go kill some Southerners today. Okay. And it's completely false, right? It's completely false. And so, again, it wasn't really until the 20th century that this narrative of the South as victim began to get overturned. Having said that, before we go any further, we've got a couple more things to talk about before we turn our attention to the West. For a little bit, why don't we take a 10-minute break? When we come back, we will talk about some more relatively depressing stuff, unfortunately. Also, if you came in a little bit late and I didn't call your name, please stop by and let me check you off.